I'm going to begin with a story of how I sort of came to some of the conclusions that I've arrived at regarding what presidents should aim to do. The story takes place about 9 years ago, in the spring of 2009. And I received an invitation, an emailed invitation, from somebody identifying himself as a member of President Barack Obama's White House staff. And they asked me if I wanted to come to dinner at the White House. I'd been studying presidents for quite a while, and I had met former presidents, but I'd met a couple of presidents while they were in office. But this was the first time to get serious face time with a president while he was doing what presidents do. So I arrived and found that I was one of a small group of historians who were invited by President Obama to come to the White House and give him and his administration some insight on how previous presidents have dealt with the problems confronting them. It struck me and some of my historian colleagues who were present that this was quite unusual among presidents. It's very rare that presidents have any kind of historical sensibility, or for that matter, observable historical interest. But Barack Obama did, maybe because he had been a college professor. And this was like a seminar. So there were about 10 of us historians and one president. And I reflected on the fact that 10 to 1 is a really good student to teacher ratio. To have 1 to 10, 1 pupil and 10 professors, I've never seen anything like this. So the dinner began, and at the beginning of the dinner, the president and his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, described their impressions of the presidency and did sort of a quick rundown on who they considered to be the great presidents. The term that they actually used were transformative presidents. This is a term from political science, and it was really clear that they had done their homework because they immediately identified the 3 presidents who are considered by a consensus of historians and political scientists to be the greatest of all presidents. And these are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And they talked about how this was the bar. Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt was the bar that they were setting for this new president and his administration. And while they were speaking, I was trying to figure out what the protocol was at an event like this. I was the guest of someone at his house for dinner, and I was trying to figure out how forcefully I should speak up when I thought that what he was saying, what the premise of this meeting was quite wrong. So, it's one thing if you're over at somebody's house for dinner, you don't like to disagree, at least not disagreeably. And when your host is the President of the United States, I did have to think it over a little bit. But I concluded that the President of the United States is a very busy man. And he probably would not have taken 2 hours out of his busy schedule simply to hear himself speak. Now, I did know that there were other presidents who would do exactly that thing. Theodore Roosevelt used to invite intellectuals, artists, people who were distinguished in other walks of life to the White House for dinner or for lunch, and then he would proceed to hold forth for 2 hours. This was not the case in this particular dinner. So I made bold. I waited a moment when it was sort of convenient. I didn't want to interrupt, but when I had a chance to speak, I said that I thought this administration might be making a big mistake if it aimed to achieve what George Washington, what Abraham Lincoln, what Franklin Roosevelt had accomplished. And this, part of it was easy. You can't be George Washington. You can't be the first president unless you're the first president. So in reality, no one tries to emulate Washington, really. And politics have changed a lot since the days of Washington. But the idea that Abraham Lincoln should be a model for a presidency in the 21st century, that Franklin Roosevelt should be a model, this was something that I thought was rather dubious. Now, I already knew that Franklin Roosevelt was on the mind of President Obama and his staff, because if you will recall, the autumn of 2008 saw a severe financial crisis. In fact, it was to that financial crisis that I owed my invitation to the White House. I had just published a book that very autumn on Franklin Roosevelt. And I don't know if any of you remember the headlines. There was a cover story in Time magazine that showed a characteristic photo of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And he's sitting in the back of an open-top Ford Model A, and he is greeting people. He always greeted people in the car because he had no use of his legs from polio several years earlier. But he had a typical sort of cock to his head, and he had a cigarette holder that always went up at this jaunty angle. And that was on the cover of Time magazine, except that the face of Barack Obama had been photoshopped onto the face of Franklin Roosevelt. And the caption over the picture on the cover said, "Franklin Delano Obama, ? Because the question on everybody's mind was the financial crisis of 2008 going to lead to the Great Depression of 2009 and after, in the way that the financial crisis of 1929 led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So Barack Obama had good reason, I guess, to invite somebody who knew something, or at least had published a book recently about Franklin Roosevelt. So that's why I was there. But anyway, I thought that for the Obama administration to take as its model the Lincoln administration, Abraham Lincoln, or Franklin Roosevelt, was a really bad idea. And I made bold to say so. And I said, I think that it would be a really good idea to keep in mind a paradox of American political history, especially as it applies to presidents. And the paradox is this, that the greatest presidents preside over the worst times. And if you think about it for a moment, Abraham Lincoln, he presided over the Civil War. There was never a worse time in American history. This was the great disaster of American politics and American life during the 19th century. And for Franklin Roosevelt, well, Franklin Roosevelt presided over the Great Depression, the worst economic experience in American history, and then World War II, which was the worst 5 years in the history of the world. So if you're going to think, I want to be like Lincoln, I want to be like Roosevelt, you might imagine, and in fact, I'm sure President Obama and his staff were imagining that somehow they could graft the success of a Lincoln or the success of a Franklin Roosevelt onto some somewhat less dire period. But this is the essence of the paradox. You don't get to be a great president unless the country is in grave crisis. And this for a couple of reasons. One, the Constitution is written in a way that requires the president to divide his powers with Congress and with the court system. So a president can't govern as independently as most prime ministers, for example, can. In parliamentary systems, prime ministers are the leaders of government by virtue of having a majority in the parliament, in the legislative system. In the United States, that's not the case. The president is checked. The powers of the president are checked by Congress and the courts. So in the first place, the Constitution is set up to make it difficult for presidents to accomplish much, certainly to accomplish much independently. But the second reason, and this is a reason that is sort of, it goes to the heart of, I'll call it American political culture, not so much the Constitution, but political culture. And this is that the United States historically has overwhelmingly been a status quo system, one in which the status quo is favored. It's favored in politics, it's favored by the Constitution, which is a recipe for obstruction. And obstruction always favors the status quo. But why are Americans so pleased with the status quo? Now, I should qualify this, because I could ask you, how many of you are pleased with the status quo? And you'd have your own opinions. Americans grumble all the time about politics. But the grumbling almost, in fact, it never has, except for one time in American history, that is during the Civil War, risen to the level where anybody did anything seriously violent about it. And if you think about the success of the United States in world history, for the last quarter millennium, for the last 250 years, the United States has been the roaring success of world history. America's system, whether you grumble about it on an everyday basis, has been tremendously successful in delivering prosperity, peace, and opportunity to more people than any other system in history. So, it's not surprising that there is a preference for the status quo. But occasionally the status quo breaks down. And then presidents have a chance to break out of the stranglehold that the Constitution applies against them and that the status quo imposes on them. When the system breaks down, as it did during the Civil War, when half the country, 11 of the states, seceded from the Union, and Lincoln had the opportunity to accomplish things that had been impossible to accomplish before. First of all, he could use his powers as commander-in-chief. Secondly, the largest part of the opposition party left the Union, leaving Lincoln and his Republicans in charge. And to show you what you can accomplish during a crisis, especially during the crisis of war, think about the fact that the American political system had been trying to deal with the contradiction between a republic, a system of government in which political power arises from the people, and slavery. Slavery is one where political power clearly does not arise from slaves. They have no political voice at all. There was a fundamental contradiction between this idea that people exercise power equally, that's sort of the Declaration of Independence, and the existence of slavery. And for 70 years, this question of how you square this circle had vexed the American political system, and nothing good had been able to be done about it. 70 years. And then the crisis develops. Lincoln leads the country to war. And within a year and a half, the knot of slavery, the Gordian knot of slavery, has been cut with the sword of war. This is why Lincoln is revered the way he is. He held the Union together, he ended slavery, but he was allowed to do it only by the crisis confronting the country. Absent the crisis, Lincoln would have been another James Buchanan. Look at Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, he became president at a moment when the American economic system, which had a spotty but overall very good record of delivering prosperity to millions of people, had collapsed. It was on life support. And Americans who had been thinking for a while, maybe we need a more active government to deal with the great power of big business and of the American capitalist system. Americans had been thinking about this for a while, but they had never been able to generate the kind of working majority they needed to make it happen. But with the Depression, the capitalist system, American business, was utterly discredited. And Americans were willing to say to the president, do what is necessary. Do what is necessary to fix the system, to alleviate the pain the system's failure is inflicting on everybody. In most cases, even today, we think of American politics as polarized, divided. And it is. But I would say this is the normal status of American politics. The reason that Americans can't decide what to do about healthcare, what to do about business regulation, what to do about immigration, what to do about foreign policy, what to do about all this stuff, is not that those rascals in Washington can't get their act together. It's that the American people can't get their act together. We are split pretty much down the middle on these big issues. Occasionally, however, there is a working supermajority on the side of one thing or another. This happened during the Great Depression. It's what allowed Franklin Roosevelt to launch the New Deal. And the New Deal was followed by World War II, which allowed Roosevelt to position himself as President of the United States as leader of the free world. So I didn't say all of that at the dinner at the White House. But I did just suggest a little bit of this. And I said, you know, unless, speaking to President Obama, unless you're expecting another civil war, unless you're expecting another Great Depression or World War, maybe you ought to lower the sights a little bit. You know, I don't think you're going to be another Abraham Lincoln, because we all hope that crisis doesn't develop. I don't think you're going to be another Franklin Roosevelt, because we all hope that that crisis doesn't develop. Maybe you should lower your aim a little bit. Consider modeling yourself after the other Roosevelt, after Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is ranked by historians and political scientists to be just below Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. He's about fourth or fifth. He's a progressive president, one who pushed the envelope of government responsibility for public affairs, but who, from the standpoint of the American people, had the great advantage of presiding over 7.5 years of peace and prosperity. So this was the message that I conveyed to President Obama and the members of his staff who were there. And the president said, oh, thank you, that gives us a lot to think about. He was a tough man to read. His staff, they just sort of shook my hand when the dinner was over and said, okay, you know, thanks for the suggestion, you've given us a lot to think about. I came back to Texas, and the next day, I got an email from the same staff member who had organized it. It said, Professor Brands, thank you for coming from the University of Texas and coming up to talk with us. We really have, you've benefited from your comments on the nature of the presidency and what's required. But the email ended, but we still think this can be a transformative presidency. Thank you.